This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 361, entitled Arming Male High Schoolers and Male Undergraduates with Masculist Verbal Weapons. Description. With the rise of feminism in the high schools and campuses, life becomes increasingly miserable for males. This flyer aims to give young men masculist verbal weapons so that they can more than hit back at the MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, by haranguing them out of the room with all their monoconscious feminazi hypocrisy. Now the flyer itself. Make it a bit bigger. Arming male high schoolers and male undergrads with masculist verbal weapons, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Life is becoming increasingly miserable for male high schoolers and male undergrads due to the rise of feminist ideology, causing young women to see young men as toxic, as morally inferior, and hence to be treated with disdain, derision, and contempt. This flyer is aimed at these male high schools and male undergrads to give them masculist verbal weapons that they can use against young feminazis, beating them at their own game, reversing the tables, by pointing out to these monoconscious young feminazis that in fact women oppress men far more than vice versa, since women's oppression of men is far more sustained, lasting decades. Once these young men are intellectually armed with masculist ideas, they'll be given the confidence that if they are attacked with feminist rhetoric, they can more than hit back. They will be able to harangue the feminazis out of the room with a verbally violent and scientifically powerful verbal masculist attack, which will change the zeitgeist in high schools and on campuses, giving men back their self-pride, their sense of genetic superiority, based on what science shows to be the case. This flyer imagines a verbal confrontation between a rabid young undergrad feminist who is strictly monoconscious, who knows absolutely nothing about masculist ideas, and hence feels she has all the reason in the world to attack men for all the horrible things that men have done to women throughout history. She feels she has every right to be intellectually and emotionally hostile towards men, and defends her view with real passion. Unfortunately for her, for the first time in her young life, she is confronted by a well-informed, bi-conscious masculist who is smarter than her, who knows all her feminist arguments, since he is bi-conscious. But that also implies that he also knows a lot about masculist ideas and is in a position to beat her at her own game with a verbally angry masculist tirade, giving the young feminazi a real taste of her own medicine so that she learns how it feels to be treated with contempt for being a member of her sex, which the other sex sees as genetically inferior and morally inferior if she has fluffy feminist views, which nearly all feminists do. So it's very painful for her to be accused of being a fluffy feminist hypocrite and be considered so evil that if her fluffy feminist views continue, she will risk being killed in a sex war that the responsible males, the masculist soldiers, will launch, utterly rejecting the idea that the fluffy feminists and all their short-sightedness and callousness in the divorce courts are indirectly wiping out whole populations because they have made divorce so toxic for men that in many Western countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. Intellectually armed with such masculist ideas, this young masculist feels he is in an intellectual position to harangue back at the young feminazi, expressing his hatred at the fluffy feminist hypocrisy of the young feminist, sending her away with a real flea in her ear. Here is how such a diatribe might ensue. Over the coming years, this kind of verbal fisticuffs will take place millions of times until these monoconscious feminazis absorb masculist ideas, or they are browbeaten into accepting them by their bi-conscious friends, who frighten them with images of being babyless in their 30s due to quality young men hating them so much for being monoconscious feminazi vermin, that they are forced to rot on the shelf, manless and hence babyless, or if they do manage to get pregnant, they'll have to pay for the kid on her own, because no man will. Here's how the dialogue might go. F, that's female, feminazi. Quote,
"Down with the patriarchy! Men have oppressed women for centuries. Look at men's denial of the right to vote for women. Look at rape. Look at women's lower pay for equal work. Look at men's denial of women entering the professions. I could go on and on. History shows clearly how men have oppressed women. So feminists like me see men as morally inferior, to be put in their place, to be stripped of their patriarchal attitudes, punished if necessary. Women need to take power so that feminist values are implemented politically and become part of the zeitgeist, taken for granted."
End quote. M, that's male, masculist, interrupting her feminist tirade. Quote, "You are what the masculists, that's men's libbers, call an MFB, that is, a monoconscious feminazi bigot. I don't deny what you have just said, but speaking as a bi-conscious masculist, you need to learn that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because women have remained such parasites on men, not bothering to fib up, that is, become FIPs, financially independent persons, by not bothering to get a career-competent education, expecting to be able to parasite off the money of some gullible manslave for decades, having him pay for her to sit on her fat parasitic ass raising her kids in a middle-class house that he pays for. A decade later, she will take him to the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system and have him financially massacred by taking his kids with 90% probability, taking his house, half his stuff, forcing him to pay child support to his kids he will barely see. And if the ex-wife is a real fluffy, that is, a masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man, he will probably have to pay her alimony for life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fib up, that is, become a fib, pulling her own financial weight, and not expect to parasite off a man, fluffy style. Fluffies are vermin to masculists, to be wiped out, because they are manslavers. Manslavery is slavery. Slavery rouses passions. Slavery is a war issue. Look at the root cause of the US Civil War. And the masculists are at war against the fluffy parasites, aiming to wipe them off the face of the earth by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that their fluffy parasite genes are removed from the gene pool, that is, annihilating them. We masculists have an even greater hatred of fluffy feminists due to their hypocrisy, who push for equal rights for women in the parliaments, which we masculists have no problems with, but behave as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts, that is, wanting equal rights with men but rejecting equal obligations with men by not bothering to fib up. This is sheer hypocrisy on the part of the fluffy feminists, and hence is spat at by the Masculists. It can't continue because in many countries now, 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity due to the toxicity of divorce created by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. In the limit, we Masculists will kill such fluffy feminists in a sex war because we won't tolerate that these monsters indirectly wipe out whole populations. These fluffy feminists are indirect genociders who have to be stopped. F.
I think that's enough of an interruption, you male chauvinist pig.
M. Lashing back with real anger. Go fuck yourself, you obese, ugly, misandrous, male-dumping, feminazi bitch. Women like you are the most hated category of female. You're the first to be rejected by men, which is something that we Masculists broadcast to young women, telling them that if they end up like you, then they will pay a very heavy price. They will not get a man. A couple of years from now, nearly every man on campus will have been infected with the Masculist virus, not tolerating MFBs, that is, monoconscious feminazi bigots, haranguing them out of the room if they have your monoconscious attitudes. In brackets. Monoconscious means that you've only had your feminist consciousness raised and know nothing about masculism, being unconscious of how badly women oppress men, with their manslavery lasting decades, oppressing men hugely more than vice versa. The tide against MFBs will turn viciously against them in the next few years. At about the same time, the sex bots and the artworms, that's artificial wombs, will be coming up, so that men will be able to grow their own kids and prefer to sex their bots than 3/4 of women, 40% of whom are obese and another 30% are fat, hence are sexually repulsive to men, who punish such women for not bothering to make themselves sexually attractive to men by watching their calorie count and staying slim and curvy, and hence fuckable. Most women now are fuffs, that's fat unfuckables. Pretty soon, women are going to be hit by the Masculist bus, by a perfect storm against them, namely by 1. A wave of very angry Masculist rhetoric coming from Masculists like me. 2. From the rise of the sex bots and artworms. 3. A general rejection by men of women as unfuckable due to women's obesity. What are you going to do, you feminazi, when in your 30s, a decade from now, when your biological clock really starts ticking hard, you realise that you can't afford to buy a middle-class house to raise the kids that you want, that nearly all the quality men whose superior DNA you want for your kids, given your female hypergamous nature, that is always wanting to mate up with a superior male, reject you as an MFB, spitting in your face for being a feminazi degenerate. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes when that happens. The tide will have turned against you so viciously that it'll be very much in your self-interest to convert yourself into a bi-conscious feminist, learning that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, and then change your study major away from the fluffy crap that you're studying now into something that will give you a decent salary so that you will not become just another hateable fluffy parasite to be wiped out by a growing and ever more vociferous masculist movement. Your current monoconscious feminazi attitudes may make sense to you now because you know nothing about masculism. So to you, gender oppression is a one-way street, committed by men against women, whereas the reverse is more the case. As a masculist, I don't deny that men oppress women, but utterly reject your attitude that women don't oppress men. Women do oppress men, and usually for decades, by financially parasiting off them, by manslaving them, by their fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, by resisting the legislation of the paternity rejection right, showing their true hypocrisy in wanting women to have the maternity rejection right, but denying men the equivalent right, seeing men merely as cash machines to pay for women to have babies, which is something the Masculists have a real hatred of feminazis for. which is why we label them feminazis, expressing our hatred for them, for their utter hypocrisy and callousness towards men. So, I suggest you become bi-conscious. Then you'll lose your monoconscious anger at men, because you'll see that gender anger is a two-way street, that men have plenty of right to be angry at women, given women's traditional parasitism of men. Once you become bi-conscious, your monoconscious feminist anger at men will be cancelled by a corresponding masculist anger at women that is of comparable strength and oppositely directed, like two equal and oppositely directed forces. Once you become bi-conscious, you will be much nicer to men and might even be able to get a boyfriend, provided you lose your disgusting obesity, which right now makes you unquestionably a fuff. And fuffs are left to rot on the shelf by men. Fuffs are cock shrinkers. They are repulsive. I tell you that as a man, as a male. Seeing a woman like you naked would instantly and instinctively generate the yuck reaction in me and in nearly any male. So, if you want to have any kind of agreeable life in the future, I strongly advise you to become bi-conscious and to slim right down. Otherwise, you're going to remain the miserable, misandrist, feminazi fuff that you currently are. With the masculist perfect storm soon coming, I predict that nearly all such women like yourself will have converted themselves into bi-conscious feminists, or have slinked away from the scene through fear of being spat at from all sides by both sexes, especially by young women who want to have babies and who will want men to help pay for them. But with you fluffy feminists still in control of the divorce courts, young men will continue to give women the finger, utterly refusing to give them their sperm. You MFBs will be hated by men and by women, so not surprisingly, most of you will disappear. Your days are numbered, so start counting. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, and textbook of 350 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word